So this is Bob Phillips. As I was saying, he has produced a great many of Australia's significant television programs, including was it Mike Walsh?
Mike Walsh, Graham Kennedy, Don Lane. Fairly endless list here.
Daryl Somers.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. And which we'll talk about. But first I'm going to play a 10-minute video that Bob and I put together the other day.
Well, this is original cinema projector that was used on the Mornington Peninsula at Chelsea, I think actually. It's an old Cayley, and that's how I started as a assistant projectionist, or spool boy as they more generously regarded them.
Right.
And it meant I worked with some incredible people. Some of these old projectionists were real characters, you know, they were people who were so dedicated to their craft, and they were showmen. You know, they took great pride in what they put up on the screen. And I started off as a very nervous schoolboy, and my first job was running slides, you know, the advertising Val Morgan slides at interval.
Oh, okay.
Which coordinated with an audio disc, vinyl disc. And invariably the slides were in the wrong order to the audio. But it was the actual. I was always impressed with the professionalism of these guys. You know, some of them were real characters, and you know, drink and late nights and be part of the existence. Yes. But from the point of view of doing a show, they were terrific professionals. Yes. and there were complications like we never ever had enough, even in the heyday of movies in Melbourne, we never had enough prints. So they used to switch programs with different cinemas. So you'd have guys in motorbikes. When one spool finished, the guy would run with that spool to the next cinema, and this could go on all night.
They were still doing it in the 80s when I was driving taxis. So they'd give me they'd say, don't pick anybody else up, just go straight from that cinema to the next, and give them the spool, which I did.
Exactly, and of course there are odd nights where we got out of sequence and started the wrong program, which caused total chaos, but that was all part of it.
And so, how did you get that very first job? I mean, what took you to apply for that job?
Well, look, I begged to get a job at the Old Circle Theatre Essendon, and I think out of sympathy, they allowed me to start and wind film. That was my chore. And then I spent a lot of time working as a relief assistant operator for Hoyts. You know, they'd ring up, you know, like 5 o'clock in the afternoon or even 7 o'clock at night and say, look, can you go to the Trocadero Theatre at Footscray? And they'd send a cab. And I did that for a while. Then I got a job working for what they call Progress Pissy Pictures, which was the Progress Hall in West Coburg. Yes. And that was run by a couple of real movie enthusiasts, a guy called Harold Davison, who was quite well known in the cinema industry, and also Ted Stevens, who was an old theatre projectionist, and they taught me everything. You know, at that stage we were still running nitrate film, and quite often I was left there to run the show, you know, with this nitrate film breaking and in dreadful condition. But and I was sort of 17, I think, at that stage. Yes, yeah. It was, you know, it was a terrific experience.
So what year was that when you first got into it?
Oh, this was 1958, about. 1958. 57, 58.
Okay.
Look, when I started, there was no real threat that they saw to the cinemas. You know, they were still doing big business and the houseful signs were still going up. But within a year of me starting, the television thing had really taken over, and they were quite often you know, they were empty houses. I remember going to a cinema at called the Waratah in Ascot Vale as a relief operator, and I arrived there about an hour before the show, and the time went on, and eventually there were two people, a husband and wife, sitting down in the front stalls, and the manager had to go down and say to them, look, I'm sorry, there won't be a show tonight. And that was the start of the end. The Waratah eventually, I think, became a service station. I started the record company called Vamp, Probably, it would have been middle 60s, and produced records for local artists and jazz groups.
And who was in the band?
Probably the most notable guy in that band was a guy called Ray Evans, who played brass of some sort, and he went on to manage Renee Gayer. He became an artist manager and worked with Michael Gudinski in the Mushroom days. That was for the Penguin Award, and that was I got that as producer of the Ernie Sigley show. About 1974, I think.
1974, and was that when Denise Drysdale started working with you?
Yeah. Ding Dong. That was a record I produced.
Well, I've got a handful of songs to sing you. Can't stop my voice when it longs to sing you. Old songs and new songs and songs to bring you.
So that's Judy and Fred in...
Fred Bear's Breakfast a Go-Go. And this goes back to 1969 at Channel 10 or Channel O, as it still was in those days. And it was a 5-day-a-week breakfast show from 7 o'clock in the morning. And Judy had to work with a bear who didn't talk, so it meant that she had to do dialogue for both of them. But the bear was played by an incredibly talented guy called Ted Dunn, and Ted somehow managed to get terrific emotions out of this character. When Ted was angry, you could tell, but also he had the ability to put a lot of emotion through the bear, and of course became quite a kid's favourite. Compared to Channel 9, it was very primitive in those days.
Yes.
It didn't have the professionalism that Channel 9 had. That was produced for the movie The King, the story of Graham Kennedy. Bit of merchandising they had. He put all these microphones under the studio audience and captured their responses.
So under the how many microphones would that have involved?
I can't remember, Graham. It would have been a couple of dozen.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
And it was so effective. It just changed the whole feel of sitting at home. You could hear all these laughs and comments that the audience was making. That's one of the early picture tubes from the very early days of Channel 9 in Melbourne. That's a black and white tube from one of the original Pi cameras. And they were very, at that time, extremely expensive. Going by the cameras, even the ones you're using today, they were not all that sensitive to light. So we used to use an enormous amount of lighting for the early variety programs like in Melbourne Tonight and the programs around that era in Melbourne television. But that's a little memento that I managed to save from the old television city when it was demolished.
In the reflection, you can see the camera I was using.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, you're doing well, Graham. That's no special significance. That's one of the early handheld cameras, and these days very commonplace, either on news or even on outside broadcasts. But again, very efficient. This is looking at the television museum that Judy Banks and I set up on the Mornington Peninsula many years ago. That's Rolf Harris's wobble board, which was the original wobble board used by Rolf. And to the left-hand side of the screen, memorabilia belonging to Judith Durham, in fact, including the tambourine that's used on Georgie Girl. And we ran the museum for about 10 years, and it was a terrific reaction to it. We had a lot of groups, Probus groups and Rotary groups and things like that through there. But it became, without any sort of government assistance, it became a little bit like running a milk bar. It was 7 days a week, 9 to 5. with terrific people that went through, people who loved the era. But I think as television moved on, a lot of what we were showcasing is now yesterday.
Here it is there.
Well,
What
this
is
is
that?
this is something that everyone I think remembers. Hector Crawford, who was a great pioneer with Melbourne television, and this was actually an American a Nazi scout car, which was basically built on an old Volkswagen, and it was I think it was made for the Sullivans when the Sullivans went to
Oh,
war.
yeah, okay.
And Hector was quite proud of this prop, and he donated it to the television museum when we started the museum. In the background, you'll see the old. Some of you would remember the old Darrod's wheel, which was very much a part of in Melbourne Tonight in those days, and they had a host of wheel girls. Eventually, as the years went on, they became wheel boys, with of course Bert Newton being the main one with Don Lane. But Darrod's was the style store in the heart of Bourke Street, and I think Darrod's is gone, and of course the wheel's gone, and sadly the museum has gone. On the right of the screen there, you'll see one of the cameras that was used on the 1956 Melbourne Olympics, which at the time were state of the art, but by today's standards, fairly primitive. Lots of photos there that we had, including Jackie McDonald on the right hand side there. It became one of the stars of Hey Hey It's Saturday, obviously. But the museum, most of the components that we were very proud of ended up at the centre of the moving image in Melbourne at Federation Square. Unfortunately, a lot of them are in storage, but things like Dexter, the robot from Perfect Match, is still there on display. On the right-hand side, there is some of you would remember Jerry G. Of course, Ron and Jerry were one of the pioneers on Melbourne television. And a gentleman there who I think took these photos, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's Russell Devlin.
That's the Jerry G. doll. And these days, from a collector's point of view, they're worth a whole lot of money. Unfortunately, that's one of the original Aussie Ostrich prototypes made for Ernie Carroll when he was Aussie Ostrich all those years ago on Hey Hey. And that's Dexter the robot, star of Perfect Match, and he again now resides up at Federation Square, and the host of Perfect Match, Greg Evans, is now a marriage celebrant.
You started basically sweeping the floors.
Well, no, I started, as we sort of saw before, I started as what they call a spool boy.
Yeah.
Working for various cinemas around Melbourne. And the spool boy meant doing everything that the real projectionists didn't want to do, like winding film and splicing film and that sort of thing. And unfortunately, it was the sort of dying end of the cinema industry, not only in Melbourne, but in Australia. We went from having house full signs a couple of nights a week to a situation where I can remember working at a cinema called the Waratah at Ascot Vale in Melbourne. And we arrived there to do the show, and eventually, just before showtime, the manager came to us and said, look, there was only an elderly couple in the audience. He had to go down and say to them, unfortunately, there'll be no show tonight. And that was sort of the beginning of the end. Hoyts, who I worked mainly for, went into sort of panic mode, and they did incredible things. They went to the extent of rationing the toilet paper that was supplied to the cinemas. You remember the chaser lights that went around the prosceniums of the theatres? They got to the stage of replacing every second globe, and there were enormous economic measures. And I thought at this stage that there is no future in this. So I applied for. Firstly, I applied for a job at the ABC, and I went down there and had an interview at Rip and Lee with a panel of experts there. I think this was just about the time that ABC television went to air, And they said, what do you do, or what do you know? And I said, well, look, I was a projectionist or assistant projectionist. And they said, well, you obviously haven't got any technical knowledge, have you? So that was the end of the interview there. So I applied for a job at Channel 9, and I got a job working in the film department, which meant 12 hours a day winding film and putting in commercials. The film, 16mm film, was sent out from the States, and there'd be little messages in the film saying place commercial here. And that's what I did for 12 months. And it was, I don't know, it was incredibly, they were a terrific team of people to work with. But it really wasn't television. And one night I was working winding film at 9 o'clock at night, and this gentleman walked into the film department and introduced himself as, he said, my name is Graham Kennedy, which is a bit superfluous. He was at that stage the king of television.
The face.
But he had a look at me in my dirty white dust coat winding film, and he said, you enjoying working in this business? And I said to Graham, look, I've always wanted to get into show business. And he had one look at me and he said, this isn't show business. Show business is down on the floor where we do the show. So eventually I got into production as a cable man on some of the live shows, again, including in Melbourne Tonight, and some of the big specials they're doing those days with people like Diana Trask and what they call the BP super shows. And by working my way up, sort of doing cameras, and I realised, or I think they realised, that I wasn't that good a cameraman, but I have to say the head cameraman at the time was a delightful guy called Don Hauser, but he was a pastry cook, and he was still baking cakes the day before he started at Channel 9. So he was head cameraman, but I played about with cameras for a while, and then found that really what I enjoyed doing was floor managing, and I became floor manager, and eventually worked my way up to be producer, and ended up with the wonderful title of executive producer. And when the worries really started.
And you were actually producer of the Graham Kennedy show.
Well, I was.
Ironically.
With the early in Melbourne Tonight, so I was a floor manager, and then when Graham did 13 years in Melbourne Tonight, and eventually retired and came back and did a national program called the Graham Kennedy Show, which I produced up until the time that we had the infamous Crow Call, which many of you would remember. And Graham went off air, and then I produced people like Ernie Sigley and Don Lane and Daryl Somers, eventually with Hey Hey Saturday.
So did you have, when you started, was it ever a goal to be a producer? Or?
I look, not directly, but I think that I found a way that there was no future in really being a cameraman or a production assistant or even a floor manager at that stage. That the first program I ever produced was a crazy talent show called Kevin Dennis New Faces, which was live to air on a Saturday morning, and that was real live panic television. And it was hosted by Frank Wilson. I found out very quickly in the piece that the people didn't want to see real talent; they wanted to see bad acts. So I made it a policy to fight all the bad acts that I could find in Melbourne, and it became a rating success, which eventually was moved to prime time on a Sunday, and became, I think, eventually Australia's New Faces, and discovered people like John Williamson.
So how did the bad acts feel about that?
Oh, well, I think some of them were. It was an incredible situation. It was live to air on a Saturday morning. I think from memory it was 8 o'clock. And some of the acts obviously had primed themselves the night before, and were not totally sober on the actual morning. And the program was sponsored by Kevin Dennis Motors, and Kevin Dennis himself was quite a character. But we often found that the second-hand cars, the the Holdens he had, we couldn't start. So we had to push them into the studio to do the commercial, then push them back out again. So it was a pretty insane environment, and it was we had some terrific people, but we ended up using judges who were fairly critical of the acts, and in some ways it was a little bit cruel, I think, but good television.
So the meaning of producer means different things in different genres, like relation, say, theatre or putting music CDs together. In what sense, what was the role of a producer in television in those days?
Well, I think in all aspects, the producer is more or less the architect who designs the format and coordinates things like the budget and booking the acts and things like that. Progressively, it's moved more into or a financial situation where the producer is the person who, these days, with streaming and independent film production, is the one who has to get the money together. But in those days, it was more the producer was more hands-on and a builder and architect, if you like.
Okay, and to what degree did like sponsorships govern production values?
Oh, very much so. I think in the early variety days that I began, I quote back to in Melbourne Tonight, the sponsors were firstly horrified by what Graham Kennedy was doing to their products. We had sponsors like
I remember
Ralph Merton, who was a very prestigious shoemaker in Melbourne, and Graham came up with the slogan of if they're hurting, they've got to be Ralph Merton. And he did other dreadful things like Miss Crisps, which he found hard to say. I find hard to say, but he had at one occasion he crunched up a package of Smith's crisps to show just how little there was in the pack. And the reaction normally of the sponsor, the next morning they would ring our national sales manager and cancel. They'd cancel the 12 months contract. By 2:00 in the afternoon, they'd be back on the phone realising that they'd sold out of product all around Australia.
Okay.
But in answer to your original question, the sponsors in those days governed the program. They were the lifeblood that kept it on air.
Right, yeah. And while we're at it, tell us about the cat.
The cat.
Yeah.
Well, I think of all the live commercials we did, the most famous one or the funniest one that I can remember was when they first started putting cat food in cans, and this was the first cat food that was released in cans. It was called Kitty Cat, and the slogan that they came up with was "Pussy in a Can." We can imagine what Graham Kennedy did with that. He used that with total abandon. But the commercials were actually pretty boring. They were Graham and a wonderful lady down here called Miffy Marsh, and they went on week after week, and they're just boring commercials. They were selling a bit of product, but nothing like what they envisaged. Anyway, a few weeks into the campaign, the sponsor decided that we should have a little kitten in the commercial, and they got this little puss, and the idea was that the little cat would come out once a week, eat up its kitty cat, and grow into a fine, healthy-looking normal cat, which the people at home, the viewers, would watch, and we had a competition to name the little puss, and it was terrific. And in 10 weeks they sold like $1 million worth of kitty cat. But I think on week 10 or week 11, they made this terrible discovery just before the show that the little puss had died. And, this was all happening 10 minutes or so before the show started. And Miffy Marsh, the presenter, was running around saying, well, what do we say? How do we explain this? And Graham sort of tended to think, well, we'll talk about this cat killed from eating kitty cat, which I'm sure he would have done. But in the confusion, there's a young prop guy who probably has gone on to be managing director or something like that. But he had the presence of mind to get in his car, drive around the streets of Richmond, where Television City was. It was a cold winter's night. And he found a cat sitting up on a brick fence. I don't know how many of you are cat owners or cat lovers, but they normally don't do what they're told. But somehow or other, he coerced this cat to get in the car with him, come back to the studio, and got it into the studio. Graham had one look at it in the lights, under the lights. There was a dreadful big tabby cat with one ear missing and a crooked tail. And Graham said, we can't do this. We won't get away with this. But in the panic and confusion of it all, they got the old cat. Halfway through the show, he comes up on the host set. He's looking around at the lights and the cameras, and he doesn't know where he is. And he spots a saucer full of kitty cat and has it in one gulp. They put down another saucer full, and I think eventually put down 5 saucerfuls of kitty cat. And it was a very funny commercial, which went for about 20 minutes, which you'd never get away with in these days. Anyway, at the end of the show, they put him back in the car, somehow or other found the right house, put him back up on the brick wall. I think the next morning he would have woken up and wondered, where was I? I was in show business last night. But the funny thing, which is, I think, a bit indicative of the audiences in those days, there was no comment. There was no outrage as to what had happened to this little kitten from one week to being this dreadful alley cat the next week. And the sponsor very wisely didn't intervene, but it was one of the funniest moments I've had with live commercials, I think.
And before we move on from Graham Kennedy, what always intrigued me was the microphones under the seats.
Yeah, well, Graham, I think Graham understood television better than a lot of the people in those early days, and he became very demanding. He became very demanding as to how he was directed, how the show was shot, and also as a performer and as a comedy performer, he became totally frustrated that he could hear audience laughs, but he knew that the audience laughs weren't going to air. And this was an audio problem that they battled with. But eventually, coming back from England was an Australian guy called Colin Stevenson, and he was installed as Graham's audio operator, and just a brilliant audio man. And Graham explained the situation to him and the frustration. And Colin, within a week, had microphones installed under about 30% of the seats in the audience. And the problem was solved, and they kept the king of television happy.
And you thought, what, a couple of dozen mics?
Oh, yeah, at least a couple of dozen, I would think.
Yeah. That's amazing.
It seemed like a simple thing, but it was in Graham's mind, it was a huge frustration.
Not having them, not having
it.
Yeah. So eventually, and you also did a number of shows like Mike Walsh. I mean, we've come to know learn that people who host some of these shows, like Mike Walsh, end up being some of the richest people in the country, in the various countries that they do it.
That's right.
So I can't imagine all the hosts of the shows were in that position to negotiate that kind of deal.
No, they weren't. Look, I think that Graham, for many years, he did in Melbourne Tonight, wasn't that highly paid, and the big money came later. Virtually in the days more with Ernie Sigley was well paid. Mike Walsh made a fortune, and of course Mike had a contract with Channel 9, and at one stage there was an argument over money, and he fronted. I'm not sure whether it was Kerry Packer or Frank Packer. I think it was Kerry Packer, and he said, argued with Kerry Packer over the contract, and Kerry ripped up the contract in front of him, and which meant that Mike was paid out for about 3 years, I think.
Right.
So there was a lot of drama with money, but in those early days there wasn't big money. I think. Eventually, in later years, Daryl Somers became a big money earner with Hey Hey It's Saturday, which had an enormous run, of 28 years or so.
Yeah, and with Packer at one stage, I think he rang up during the Wheel of Fortune and said, "Give her the money."
Yeah, Gary Packer was an incredible character. I can remember one night. people imagine that that Graham Kennedy fired every night and was funny every night. But I can remember at one stage with the Graham Kennedy show in the early 70s that we had just one very bad night where Graham didn't fire. The talent wasn't all that good, so there were a lot of technical problems. And the crew sort of slumped back to the boardroom after the show for a drink, and were confronted by Kerry there with his sleeves rolled up and a can of Tarex. He didn't drink, but he listened for a couple of hours while Graham complained about different things, and the audio operator complained about the equipment. Mike McCall Jones, the writer, was in tears, and this went on until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And eventually, I was sitting next to Kerry, and he nudged me, and he said, "Mate, don't they realise this is only bloody television? Only bloody television?" But for a man who loved television, it was a strange statement, because he was, as people would know, he was dyslexic. He owned newspapers, but didn't read them. And he watched television all day. There was always the Channel 9 monitor on in his office, and he had a great feel of, Kerry was a playboy and womanizer and all that, but he was had very big moral standards about, what people should watch. And there's a lot of programs these days that Kerry would have never let get on air, but he was an incredible character. He had a lot of funny stories that he would have heard of Peter Feynman, who was a very smart director back in those days, just a bit of a genius director. And he directed all the big shows and all the specials, Paul Hogan shows and things like that. And at one stage, Peter was just totally burnt out, and he went to Sydney to have a meeting with Kerry, and Kerry listened to him with all these worries and the problems that he was having with the Don Lane show and budgets and things like that. And he said, "Kerry, I've come close to taking my life." And Kerry looked at him for a minute and opened his desk drawer, pulled out a revolver and handed it to him, which stopped Peter in his tracks, I think. But Kerry was one of the real characters of Australian television. He loved television, which is the basic thing.
Right. So would anyone here like to ask some questions of Bob?
I'm sure
I noticed there's some carols in the audience. Are they related to the carol that you mentioned?
I know, I'm sure I bored everyone sufficiently so far. But I'm happy if you have questions to. Thank you very much for hearing me out today.
Looks like Lynn's unmuted her mic.
Oh, I didn't want to say anything, but I just unmuted it. Yeah, Bruce and I are both here from Ernie's children.
Terrific.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Ernie in capacity.
Is Bruce there now?
Yeah, he's here. He's just on.
Oh, okay. Hi, Bruce. And nice to talk to you both.
Yeah, Bob. Yeah. Sorry, I missed the beginning of the very start of the presentation.
Look, I'll just
So did we.
I'll do it all again once. No, look, Bruce, it was terrific to catch up with Bruce and Lynn, not that long ago now. And Ernie, just a wonderful person, and he not only me, but he taught a lot of us a lot about television. I think he was just a terrific influence on television, and I don't have to say that to you both. Oh, there he is. He was a lovely man.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, sure you both agree.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
And he was very much a part of Daryl Somers' success, and Daryl certainly. I was at a function not that long ago, and Daryl again was giving terrific mentions of your dad. Anyone else with a question there?
Is that you, Ray?
Yeah, Bob, you'll probably remember the date when the coaxial cable between Melbourne and Sydney came into play. I grew up in Sydney, right, and watched. I remember the beginnings of television from a Sydney point of view. I remember the Graham Kennedy show, that title, And I remember the rivalry between Melbourne and Sydney, and we were supposed not to like stuff from Melbourne, all that sort of stuff.
Of course.
But and shows were recorded individually, but and sometimes were kinescoped. But at some point, there was the link between Melbourne and Sydney, which was called the coaxial cable, came into play. Do you remember when that actually was? The year that it happened?
Look, I don't remember. I would imagine from memory it was probably mid to late 60s. Would that be right? I think it would.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I can remember we did something which was pretty ill-fated. We did a cross with Graham and Don Lane to sort of celebrate the start of the coaxial cable. And as you say, the rivalry between Melbourne and Sydney, not only in audiences, audiences didn't particularly like Melbourne people and vice versa. But in those days, TCN really didn't like people from GTV. So it wasn't a terrific working atmosphere, but the cable really changed the whole face of television as we knew it. We went from when I started, there was obviously no videotape, and as you said, we were using 16mm cine recordings, and it was all pretty primitive. Videotape made a lot of change to it, but the coaxial cable was just a godsend in so many ways. But apart from the fact that farmers kept digging it up, which is a problem.
Was there? I know you mentioned when I saw you the other day that there was a big difference in professionalism between, say, Channel 9 and Channel O when 10 was O.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in what way did that?
Look, I think it was. We're talking Melbourne now, basically, but I think that Channel 9 in Melbourne, I think, set the standard in all ways. From the point of view of production or lighting or engineering, set design. The shows that came out of Channel 7 were never quite up to the standard that Channel 9 had. And then eventually, as time went on, the new channel, which in those days was Channel O, and I went to work there briefly for a time. And I remember Mike McCall-Jones, the comedy writer, going there to work again for 12 months, and he referred to it as his 12 months out of television. But the Channel O in those days really, unfortunately, I think the original thought was that Hector Crawford would get the license for the new channel, which he didn't. Sir Reginald Ansett got it. But no discredit to Sir Reginald, but it just didn't have the same professionalism that 9 or 7 had, or even to some extent ABC had in those days.
And yet Crawford Productions eventually operated out of the old 10 studios.
Well, they did terrific programs like Showcase and obviously
Prisoner.
The Prisoner, of course.
Mm.
The very early days of Channel O were a struggle. They had some good, groundbreaking stuff. They had the pop show Commotion, and then later on Young Talent Time and Showcase, which were all big successes. But it was a battle, and I think the frequency alone was a battle too. Channel O didn't seem to be somewhere where people wanted to go.
So I noticed during the probably 80s that the shows, the Tonight shows that were being shown from Sydney had a far different quality of sound and than what was coming as Tonight shows that were coming out of Melbourne. And I mean, it looked like in the studio they didn't have foldbacks for the musicians. You could hear, as a performer, I could hear the difference in the more difficulty that they were having.
Yeah, but I think again, Graham, it came back a lot to In Melbourne Tonight, which was live television 5 nights a week, and it meant that they built things like they built terrific studio sound systems, and as you say, foldback and things like that.
Yeah.
And there was a great professionalism that was probably honed out of the amount of television that was coming out of what they called Television City in those days. and they had the expertise of doing massive specials with Sammy Davis Jr. and of course Frank Sinatra and people like that, and the Paul Hogan shows, which again were, terrific productions.
Any more questions, people?
No?
Can I add just a reminiscence of mine of Bob, you mentioned the way that Graham Kennedy, would send up products, which he did, and that was often the best part of the show. I can remember a particular commercial for the Australian Women's Weekly, and they were simply contracted for a while. He would, on one occasion, he picked up a copy of the Women's Weekly, and it was getting fewer pages, it was getting very thin, and he sort of held it, and he sort of bounced up and down, and he said, "It's getting pretty thin these days, isn't it?" And he said, "I've seen thicker war cries." And you tend to remember the commercials, and as you said, by sending up the commercials, the sponsors actually benefited.
Oh, they did, but look, we had, apart from Graham, we had an enormous group of presenters on the station. There were people like Jack Little, the American, Evie Hayes. I'm thinking of people like Hal Todd, Peter Smith, who's still around today. They were all terrific salesmen, and they didn't quite get away with what Graham got away with, but they were all wonderful presenters in those days. I think that that was the success of in Melbourne Tonight, the fact that the sponsors really had to battle to get on-air time on the show, and they were, the results were there. They just sold out product. I remember one product that we had, which Graham was relentless about, glow weave shirts. Some of you guys would have worn glow weave shirts, and they looked terrific, but I don't know what they were made of. They were made of some sort of synthetic nylon, and whenever your body heat got up a bit, you smelt awful. They were, and we were, as crew members, we were given these shirts to wear, and by the end of a hot, steamy night in Studio 1 or Studio 9, you couldn't stand each other, let alone yourself. But Graham somehow got onto this, and although he mocked the shirts, they sold every shirt that Glowweave could make in those days. But just it was a pattern that I don't think moved into Sydney television. I think it was something that was a bit peculiar to Melbourne, but Graham later on with the national show was able to repeat this to some extent with unsuspecting clients.
Bob, can I just ask, with your museum, how much, if any, of some of those early programs were actually recorded in kinescope and actually survived? Is there much about, and when would it start, if there is?
Look, a very good question. They back in those days, kine recording, which basically was a film camera photographing a television screen, they were very expensive. They were 16mm film and sometimes double system process. And for that reason, they were a bit cautious about how much they recorded. But one of the other problems that happened in those days that no one was very much into archiving, and a lot of these, I can remember one night leaving Channel 9 very late at night. I think we'd had a bit of a night in the boardroom. I was walking out through the car park, and I walked past a skip, and there's a film can glinting in the moonlight. And I don't know why, but I walked over and picked it up and had a look at it. And the label on the can was the Beatles Sing for Shell. And I thought, how could they throw this out? But this happened not only at Channel 9. I think the other stations were fairly reticent to get into archiving. And I can remember at one stage not long ago, walking through the corridors of the old Studio 9 in Melbourne, and there was a whole corridor full of 2-inch videotapes, which were Don Lane shows going for for 10 years. And I said to one of the videotape guys, what's happening to them? And he said, they're going to the dump. And I think there was a mentality there that really they're living for today, basically. I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question, but they were not terribly, it wasn't all that good housekeeping, I don't think. A lot of wonderful television moments, which were live to air, were never ever recorded anyway. So
television was thought of as an ephemeral kind of medium, wasn't it?
I think it still is. What do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's sad that there was some very funny things happen over the years. There's I can remember one instant or one very funny bit of television revolved around a Tarek show. I don't know whether anyone remembers. Of course, the Carroll family will remember the Tarek show, and they would remember Susan Gay Anderson. And I don't know whether you two.
Yeah.
Susan's there. Oh, fantastic!
Yes, he's there.
Susan, tell them about the rabbits. The Tarek show.
Unmute.
Unmute yourself, Sue. Sue.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a lovely little story about ads. When Terex bought the children's show, all the sponsors were in the audience, and they gave me an ad to do, and I chose this angel child from the audience, grave mistake, and set him on my knee and did the Terex ad, and then said to him, would you like to have a sip? And he said, no, thanks. My grandma said it rots your teeth. I didn't do another Terex ad. But what an era we worked in. It was extraordinary. I mean, we did a prime time Saturday night 1 hour show miming other people's singing.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. You would not imagine that could happen now.
Susan, you're not mentioning the rabbits. Can I mention the rabbits?
Oh, the rabbits. You love the rabbits, yes. Can I tell that one?
You
Lynn
tell
knows
it.
that. Hi, Lynn.
You tell it, Nolly Bell.
I was on that was the Esther show, and I was on a farmyard set with pigtails and sitting on a haystack, and one of the prop crew gave me 2 cute little rabbits on my lap, and I looked up and the cameraman was just falling over laughing out of his seat, tears rolling down his cheeks, and I thought, that's a bit cruel. I mean, I'm doing my best. And I looked down and they gave me a male and a female rabbit, and they were having a wonderful time. And I'm continuing singing, because you had to, trying to pull them apart as I sang this little delicate song. Them's for the days. Everything was live.
Oh, look, you still look terrific, Sue.
It was lovely to see you. And
I'd love to catch up sometime.
What an amazing contribution you've made to this world.
And we're still here.
Yeah, we're still above ground.
Yeah, that's right. No, I'd love to catch up sometime. Any other questions there?
Well, Bob, following on from my earlier question, things like, were they called blooper reels? When did they become a thing? How far back do they go? I think that was mostly, as I understand it, an internal thing in the studio and for the benefit of insiders. But are you aware of any of them surviving?
Oh, yes, there are. There are quite a few going back to the early days, and then they later moved into what I think all stations did were staff shows, and these were shows that a lot of the bloopers had a lot of dialogue beginning with F, which couldn't necessarily be used on air. But there were a lot of very funny things that happened. I can remember there was one staff show I can remember that had a weather girl doing the weather basically in the nude and things like that. But there were a lot of the things that happened, probably even more in recent times when they're recording things like Neighbours, that quite often were not all that well rehearsed, and actors didn't always have their lines, and things often fell into shot or sets fell over or whatever. There's a lot of that footage around with all the stations. I'm not sure whether any of it's allowed to go to the National Film and Sound Archive, but there's certainly a lot in the actual station.
There was that famous one where Graham Kennedy pulls the microphone because it got stuck and the whole set fell over.
Yeah, that's right.
There's,
No,
there's
no,
another early one that I remember seeing of Bruce Mansfield swallowing a fly while he was reading the news, and that was I think that's been repeated around the place. And I think he went from Channel 9 to Channel O, didn't he?
that's right. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, Bruce, terrific.
Bruce.
Again, another terrific character. There's another famous, more recent one with Peter Hitchner, the Melbourne newsreader, with a pigeon appearing behind him in the frame,
Really
which is
a monster.
very, very funny footage. But in answer to the original question, yes, there's hours and hours of very funny blooper materials around. They tried to do a couple of blooper shows in the past, and again, it got down to what was good taste and what could be used and what couldn't. But there is some very funny stuff there.
Thanks, Bob.
Well, that brings us round to the hour. Is there any more questions?
What do you want here?
Bob, I'm quite intrigued by this. The history of television in Australia is very much dominated by a boys' club. Women had, by the looks of it, little opportunities to have major roles, certainly behind the scenes, and to some extent in front of the camera. And I'm wondering if that was an endemic culture that you may want to comment on. And with Susie being there, and which I find so interesting.
That's a leading question. If you go by the inquiry that's sweeping through the Nine network at the moment, yes. Look, the answer probably in the days when I started at Channel 9, and certainly when Susan Gay was there, I'm sure she'd agree. It was very much a boys' club. Not so much the female talent who were treated with a lot of respect, but I think the basic premise was that women working in television, they were required to look pretty, answer the phone, make the coffee, and do the typing. And I think
yes, look, I just a little quick input there. When I was asked to be interviewed to be put under contract, I won't name who, said to me, we'll hire you if you dye your hair blonde, drop that private school accent, and wear some low-cut dresses. I'm happy to say I did none of those.
No, well, I'm happy you didn't either.
That was the attitude at that time, but the women who had some prestige were all on the ABC.
Yeah. I think the attitude, certainly in the early days when I worked at Channel 9 and it began at Channel 7, it was very much a boys' club sort of attitude. But I think the events that you're probably referring to that are in the press at the moment, they sort of more seem to apply to actually bullying and just bad work-safe practices. I don't think... I think women basically in the industry were pretty well respected and pretty well looked after.
Absolutely, and especially in the children's show with Ernie Carroll, particularly in the children's show, we were all looked after, and I felt very safe.
Yeah, well, you're very special people, and I think the management that Susan, you would have remembered. The original manager at Channel 9 was a wonderful guy called Colin Bednall. And Colin had come from, we're all frightened of him, and I'm sure you were yourself, but Colin had come direct from the old Argus newspaper where he was editor to running Channel 9. And he, in some ways, was a fearsome gentleman, but he was the sort of person who knew everyone in the building by their first name and would wander around the corridors talking to people. And he was just the most wonderful general manager that I've worked with. And his sort of idea was that he had a newspaper background, and his idea was that in Melbourne Tonight should be the front page of Channel 9. And he really, from the very early days, just knew exactly how to handle a television station and probably more importantly, how to handle people, both on air and off air.
Yeah.
Well, you were frightened of him, Susan Gay, I'm sure.
No, I had great respect, and he was a very kind and respectful man. I was in awe of him.
Oh, but you're a woman, you see.
No, I think he was like, as you said, I think he was a good man.
He was a father figure, wasn't he, in those days? Yeah.
I just mentioned here that the Penguin, Bruce has sent through some information on the chat line that the Wikipedia says that the last Penguin Award was 1990. And Arthur's given said that there's a blooper reel of Channel GTV9 Christmas party from 1969 available, and he's provided the link, and Bruce is going to provide it on with the recording.
Oh, it must be one that's been cleaned up then, but I think Bruce, be careful.
Yeah.
1990, that's terrible. That's the last award I ever got.
You got yours is 1972, but you got.
Oh yes, well, was even worse. No, I'm not sure what happened to the Penguin Awards. The Logies, I think, have been a bit invigorated in recent years with, again, production. But I'm not sure. I'm still very suspicious about the Logie Awards. I was told who'd won the Gold Logie a week before it was announced, so I'm not sure how that works.
Yeah, it's a bit of a worry, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. So you also ran an acting agency with Judy Banks for your wife, Judy Banks.
Well, that's right. Judy, when the breakfast show on Channel O ended, Fred Bear's Breakfast a Go-Go, she was basically out of work, and she was doing a bit of teaching for Crawford's, and we felt she wanted her own business, so we set up the Judy Banks School of Television, which probably meant a lot more in those days, because we had it was an opportunity for people to see themselves work on camera. No one had video cameras or smartphones or anything like that.
That's right. Yeah.
And we ran the school with a wide variety of people. A lot of them were young hopefuls. Some of them go on and end up in things like Home and Away and Neighbours. We taught politicians, car salesmen, and Judy spent 2 or 3 years teaching priests at Corpus Christi College, teaching communication. So it was an interesting era. It was a lot of people who had a lot of talent, who didn't really have much option, or many avenues, and a lot of people who had absolutely no talent, and a lot of ego. So they were an interesting section of people. But Judy always, her attitude was she loved teaching, but she'd sort of be up there doing it herself.
When I advertised this webinar, a few people came online, on Facebook, and said that they'd enjoyed working with you or meeting you, and then what a nice person you were. Some of them had gone to the acting school, and one of them, I think, was from the school, the religious school you mentioned a minute ago.
Corpus Christi,
yeah. One of them was from there. Remember Judy fondly from all that?
Well, Judy, the famous Judy Banks story is that she was teaching at Corpus Christi, which is situated in suburban Melbourne, and she really enjoyed working with these young guys. She couldn't quite understand how these guys were healthy, good-looking guys were giving up their life for God, but she was there with the best of intentions. But her boss at the time was George Pell, who people would remember, and she and George didn't get on at all. There was no friendship there at all. And Judy plotted a copybook one day she was smoking at the time, and she was called to do a lecture in one of the chapels. And as she walked into the chapel, she snubbed out her cigarette in the holy water, which was an innocent thing that only Judy Banks could do. But I don't think Cardinal Pell totally approved of that. But they were good times, and a lot of very good people came through the school.
That's good. Anybody have any stories to share or questions to ask?
Graham, I just sort of checked a little while ago the coaxial cable that Ray mentioned. there is actually a polished granite memorial in Gordon Reserve near the old Treasury building in the Parliament Gardens in Melbourne, which celebrates. It's got a map. It's incised from Sydney to Melbourne, which shows the track of the cable, and it was commemorates the completion of the laying of the cable, and the actual inauguration of it was on the 9th of April 1962, and Prime Minister Menzies actually cut the tape or blew the whistle or whatever it was. So it was a really big deal. You know, programs could be seen in Melbourne from Sydney and vice versa. So that's probably a bit earlier than you thought, Bob.
Yes, well, that is earlier, but that would be right. But I can remember at one stage they experimented with an aircraft flying between Melbourne and Sydney, beaming the signal up to the aircraft and back down to Channel 9 in Sydney, and that was sort of probably about the same era, or it might have been earlier than that. But that was in their desperation to try and get a link between the two cities. But you know, as I said before, the coaxial cable just totally revolutionised what we were doing, and it became more of a network because of that. I think a lot of people lost their jobs. Philip Brady at one stage lost his job because they decided to replace him with a host in Sydney rather than having two lots of, I think it was Concentration, I think he was working on, was the show.
In 1956, Phil Manning, the guitarist, the singer with a guitarist with Chain, his father rigged up an aerial and a television receiver in Tasmania. They lived in Devonport. This is just 1956, right at the beginning, because he worked in signals during the war, and so he somehow put all the technology together to get the signal across match straight to so they could watch the Olympics on television at his house.
Well, again, that would have been an enormous achievement to do that, because it was hard enough to get a signal from the MCG back to Channel 9, let alone getting to Tasmania. But no, things have changed. You know, you notice some of the reporters on the news now going out and doing news stories, and years ago they'd go out there with a satellite truck and an audio operator and a vision guy. These days they're basically got someone with a camera beaming it back through a smartphone. So it's, you know, things have changed a lot.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And we noticed that in the difference between the cameras that they were using on Channel 9 in the early days, and the fact that I was using my phone to make that video I made earlier.
Well, that's right. Well, look, the camera,
megapixel.
the camera you're using, or most smartphones,
it's showing us now.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, like 1,000 times better than the cameras we use to get television to air.
And you can put it in your pocket. just to put it in a nutshell. And is there anything further from anyone?
Bob, just wondering, way back when you were working on the floor on IMT, and Graham would refer to you directly, sort of breaking the fourth wall, or maybe it's a fifth wall with television, and sort of, you know, he introduced this running gag of, you know, don't look at me like that, Bob Phillips, or I'll tell him how, whatever it was. And that, you know, that brought you into the public eye to some degree, because because there would, I think at times, of course, I didn't see all the shows because I was pretty young, but I can remember some of the shows, they'd actually get a camera shot of you. And just looking back, that seems to be maybe part of the evolution of that, maybe through the variety programs, but maybe went through some of the other shows as well, of dropping all formality in terms of, you know, not referring back to how the sausage is made, and referencing technical people in the show and all of that, and that became almost a feature of like Hey It's Saturday. And Dad and Daryl did that all the time on the Saturday mornings, and and then you had technical people being well known by the public. Phil, the camera guy, Lucky Phil, and
yeah.
So, do you think that that sort of began back then with you, with Graham kind of bringing some of the crew into the program?
Yeah, I'm not sure it began with me. I think it probably, from a floor manager point of view, when I started floor managing, my boss, and Bruce, you may remember him, was a German guy called Frank Zepter. And Frank was actually knew nothing about television. He came to Channel 9 directly from World War II. He was a Luftwaffe air race.
Yeah.
And he was an incredible Teutonic German character, and a very good floor manager, but it was all about shouting and drama. And I remember at times with rehearsal that Frank would be in full flight, and Graham would point across the studio to him and say, "Frank, let's remember who won the war." And it was that sort of reaction, but I think that's where it started. Graham, don't look at me like that, Bob Phillips, I think came from Mike McCall-Jones, and Graham used it as a mechanism that if he was stuck for a moment or he could see something going wrong, it was a bit of an outlet, if you know what I mean. It was sort of a mechanism that he had something to throw to. And I was sort of, the butt of his jokes in some ways, but there were other people that he did the same too. And as you say, this transferred into Hey, and people there that other than the cast members, there were always people that he could throw to. With Daryl, I mean, could throw to, and it evolved into other shows as well. But I think it all goes back to the floor manager was the first avenue of attack, if you like.
Yeah.
But he used it as a mechanism.
Funny, because Australians really liked that sort of entertainment, that sort of, I guess, not necessarily disrespect for authority, but sort of kind of repartee with authority. I mean, Clive Robertson did the same.
Yeah, I think as Bruce said, it was a look behind the scenes. It was getting a little bit behind the curtains, behind the magic.
Yeah. I mean, that's right. And one of the rules is, don't show them the magic, how the trick is done. But you can show them glimpses like that in a humorous sort of way, and they also like things being irreverent a bit. So it was sort of the fact that we're breaking the rules. I think it had to hang over from the war. Actually, the soldiers, Australian soldiers.
Look, I think the public love it. I think they love to find out that a newsreader sits there without his pants. He sits there in shorts, and there are a lot of things that go on in television that we take for granted, but the public don't necessarily get to see.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, you still don't. It didn't take off. You don't see a lot of it these days.
Well, see, the problem these days is that a lot of cameramen, used to be the butt of Graham Kennedy's gags as well. But these days, there are not that many cameramen. You look at remote cameras in the news services and current affair and things like that. I'm not sure with the Carol sitting there whether Hey would ever work with remote cameras. I think not somehow.
No, right. Okay.
Things have changed.
So don't let me hurry you along, anybody, but we don't have to finish straight away, but if there are no more questions.
I'm sure they've got better things to do than to listen to Bob Phillips on a Sunday afternoon.
No. Bob, I was wondering, do you have any particular memories of Judy Willing in Melbourne Tonight? She used to present ads, I think, and Graham Kennedy used to try and break her up. I don't think he ever succeeded. I knew her very well in later life, Judy Goff, and she was not somebody I'd willingly mess with, on or off air.
No, look, Judy Willing, Susan Gay would remember Judy Willing. That Judy, she played Graham Kennedy pretty well. She wasn't thrown by him. and she had a lot of authority as a presenter. You know, the products that she was selling, she normally. In fact, I've got a feeling she worked for an advertising agency, didn't she? At one
Yeah,
stage?
she did. Yeah,
Yeah,
Clemenges, I think.
yeah, I think it was Clemenges, and she had a lot of authority behind her. I think she was one of the few women presenters that Graham was a little bit careful about. You know, he knew that he could get a few laughs, but and put it down as he did with you know, of course the most famous one was Rosemary Margan with the bird calls and eventually the crow call. Well, he would never have tried that with Judy Willing, that's for sure. That's a good memory. I'd forgotten Judy.
Yeah, I remember him swooping around one evening when Judy was being authoritative and go on, Judy, tell them about your blackheads, which had no effect but was quite memorable.
No, she would have handled that.
Yeah, oh, that's good. I'm glad you remember.
Definitely.
Well, there's a couple of people I'd like to thank. Russell Devlin took the photos of the museum, which is now I met sometime before it closed, which was a few years ago now. Was it 2016?
Yes, it was. It would have been about 2016. Yeah.
Yeah, and he took those, and he was one of the people that saw the promotions for this and responded. I think he might be listening via one of the gone now.
Yeah,
one of the people that were there. And Bruce for hosting the show today.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, Bruce.
That's the Zoom part of it, and everyone for attending. And it'll be available somewhere, I imagine, Bruce. Is that correct?
Yep, we'll pop it onto YouTube, and there'll be a link via the Friends of National Film and Sound Archives website. Everyone that's registered and on our mailing list will get an email about that when it happens. And actually, I think, Graham, I might, if you can send me the original video, I might insert that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's what I'll do.
Yeah.
Do I get residuals, Bruce, for this or on the replay?
Yeah, well, there'll be a bloopers reel, yeah.
Yes, right, yeah.
Thank you.
And I would apologise for my part of the technical failings at the beginning of the presentation, except my father told me in showbiz, never apologise, never explain.
But you're a musician, Graham, so you'll get away with it.
Well, he was a musician too, but yeah. Okay, so thanks everybody for attending. And therein concludes today's proceedings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Bob.